Hello, my name's Charlotte McElroy. For my mini ethnography project for anthropology of arts, I decided to look at the role that visual art happens to play in our society. I happened to do this study while I was on Ohio University's Zanesville campus. And I did it looking at student bodies. I was particularly interested in seeing how students tend to actually use visual art in the various forms that it exists in as sources of distraction or as a socialization object, as a source of being able to get into conversations with each other and essentially establish various group dynamics accordingly. This idea came to my mind when I was talking to a couple of my friends about things I could do for one of my classes, for my anthropology of arts class as a project. Since everyone had taken the body art that all my friends seemed to have as their main projects, I decided to go slightly different and look, like I said, at visual art. Now, visual art can be various different mediums. It can be through film, what we dub cinematography, photos, paintings, and draw images, which is often called still art or photographic art, or object art such as pottery. And while I was sitting in the Student Success Center one day, working on this project, getting it started a few weeks ago, I happened to look around and I noticed that my boss and a couple of my coworkers are also looking at things. I was trying to do homework, which is what this project was, but they were watching The Walking Dead and looking at Pinterest to look for designs that for their classrooms. That my friend Christy, who happened to be the first one I saw working on Pinterest and looking at things, she was planning on using some things in the classroom. There was one thing that she was looking at that I noticed quite a bit that she kept clicking back to, and it was this angel wing set. It was an image because she likes angels, and in her future classroom she wants to have it to be a welcoming environment. So I asked her why she kept going back for that, back to that particular design, and she's like, well, I like how the colors blended. It starts with pink down near the base, but then it fades to purple as it moves up. And she's like, it's the blended of the colors right in the middle that catches my eye. I'm like, okay. Two different colors, pink and purple, and they were blended beautifully, and I can understand where she's coming from. I happened to turn my attention back to my iPod at that time, and I looked at the background. Since I was in art mode, and I had just gotten done talking to art professors before I handled everything and started working on my homework, I got to looking at the design on my iPod and noticed that there were various aspects that I happen to look at and tend to stick to in terms of what I find appealing. For her, it was blended colors, but for me, it was various colors and different shades of them. The picture on my iPod happened to be in the middle lighter, but then around the edges darker, around where the lines were. And it was blended, and it showed an angle of light coming down from the top aiming toward the bottom. That was the perspective that I got on it. But looking at that, I began to wonder why it was that I liked this kind of things, and if I was the only one, or if someone else liked the same kind of characteristics I do with various colors and shading. Well, then I got to looking at the line thickness. And I went scrolling through several of the pictures that I have, some of the images and stills that I've got from various anime and movies that have various different line thicknesses. And I started noticing that all the lines on mine happened to appeal because they tended to be thicker in terms of width and apparent pressure that you could easily tell was applied. Well, looking back at Christy, I'm like, do you like how the lines give it shape? And she's like, the lines are fluid, Charlotte. I kind of need that because they're not harsh and abrasive like a straight angled line would be. I'm like, she's like, looking at yours, my lines are curved, but your lines are squared. And she's like, that to me is abrasive, so to me that's not appealing. And I looked at hers and I'm like, but that's not appealing because it's not clean cut. And she's like, well, why don't you ask people that as part of your interviews and as part of your survey as you're doing your research? Look at line thickness and see why people go for certain lines and certain shapes. I'm like, well, thanks for the idea. I think I'm going to use it. But anyway, I get to looking back at my stuff and I'm like, I'm going to work on my art homework. And then Christy pipes up. She's like, by the way, you're such a nerd. If I'm going to watch stuff like that and look at stuff like that, it's not going to be that kind of stuff. It's going to be stuff like what I'm looking at now. I'm like, okay. But from talking with her, I got to understanding and figuring out that even though there are some various definitions for anything that we call visual art or object art, or art generally, visual art can actually be looked at as a form of art that uses various mediums. Again, like I said, cinematography, still art, in terms of paintings, drawn images, and photos, or pottery. Now, when I say cinematography, this can be animation, cartoons, TV, and film. Usually cinematographer primarily tends to refer to film and TV as mediums. I've walked through the atrium numerous times, and I've heard people discussing film quite a bit. It seems to be that it's a very prevalent thing of visual art culture in our society, and again, I've noticed this on college campuses, so I got curious. I mean, you see visual art everywhere, in theaters, in homes, on billboards, in advertisements. But there are some subsets of the populations that are more attracted to it, I would say, for various reasons. And as such, it establishes a culture, which culture itself has various meanings. Used to be technically applied in terms of culture of gardening and whatnot, but it's since over time taken on various meanings to include material objects and preferences that pass along ideas and other concepts such as traditions and beliefs. But since I decided to look at college campus and the student body, I narrowed it down to asking why this group. And that posed itself for a problem for me. It posed the idea that maybe I should exclude certain subsets, but then the campus I was located on is a non-traditional campus, so I'd have to look at various age groups as well, just by virtue of it being a non-traditional campus. But as I talked to other students and got my project started, I found that there's various reasons that they tend to immerse themselves in it, and that there's various mediums that they prefer, and various points of agreement and disagreement over what things mean, and what from that I've acquired I think a basic understanding, I don't dare say advanced, a basic understanding of why we turn to these things, and visual art itself can be a focal point for establishing our culture and interchanging ideas. Just by having agreements and disagreements over preferences in terms of like line thickness, shading, color, angles in terms of film and photos. So, looking at that, I also found that there's a difference depending on the ages of the students that I was dealing with as to whether they were introduced by others or whether they were acclimated from the very beginning. The acclimation for those, the ones that were exposed from the very beginning, were the ones that happened to be the students under the age of 21 to 25. If they were in their late teens and in that earlier age group, they were acclimated to it. They'd grown up with it. But when it came to students who were older than 25, myself included, they happened to be introduced to it either by themselves, just finally figuring out, hey, I like this, or by others who taught them, such as art teachers and friends who said, hey, look at this, come watch this with me. And then long discussions would span from there. Well, either way, visual art has turned out to be a part of people's lives. As Layla Abou-Lafad discusses in her article, The Interpretation of Cultures After TV, even though she was explicitly talking about television and film in her article, she makes the point that any art form is produced deliberately for people under conditions that vary politically and historically. This is no exception for students, but it's designed to appeal to an individual. Visual art generally is usually designed to appeal and gain favoritism by certain groups. However, while her point is valid, different mediums do appeal differently to opposite poles of sides of the spectrum. Certain things appeal greatly more so for males and versus females, older versus younger students, as I found. So there is this kind of an idea, and either way, like I said, it's all part of the people's lives. You see it everywhere. You see visual art everywhere. And students, like I said, are no exception to this. They are inundated with it. Again, through the use of billboards, classes even with film and art, and advertisements. And the reasons for these different mediums appealing to different people and different genders and age groups can be partially attributed to the variances in techniques or the art aspects themselves. Again, in students I talked to, I asked about different characteristics that we often see in film and paintings, which were two of the most common mediums that were preferred among my interviewees, such as color, line thickness, angles, lighting, and shading. Among these characteristics, the students argued that they felt the images were oftentimes indicative of the emotional and mental states of the people that created them. They based this on their own feelings that they got as they looked at the images and the pieces or watched the film. For example, the one consistent thing that I heard from every single one was that the darker the lighting in the movie or the darker the colors in the image, the gloomier they tended to feel. And as a result, they thought that the artist who created that piece or the producer that produced the work in terms of film, were in a gloomy mindset, or that even the writers of the film themselves aims to have it deliberately dark and gloomy in terms of setting off the emotions. Which, this isn't surprising. Prior anthropologists have argued that images can't be ideas themselves. This is Levi Strauss, he argues this. But they can play the part of signs, or to be more precise, coexist with the ideas just by gaining significance to somebody, even though comprehension might not be there. Well, again, the lighter and the darker the images or the films tended to be in terms of their setting and the colors used, the more this actually acquired a significance, even though the idea is not confirmed or comprehended. And while I mentioned earlier that for some, visual arts have always been there and others it hadn't, this essentially points that the exposure to visual arts does play an integral role in our society, in helping, especially in helping individuals to socialize with one another. It helps set up group dynamics, and all because it's just the starting point of conversation. As I was studying my students that I interviewed, and as I sat among them and watched their behaviors, there seemed to be ebbs and flows to each group. As I asked my question, usually one or two students would pipe up and answer it, and then depending on the question I asked and the initial answers that were provided, other students in that group would start talking, and the conversation would just start up. It would take off, and there'd be comments made, quips made, postures would relax. There would be discussion over said aspects and pieces. And at the same time, all nothing but art. But it did provide some insight that, hey, one rallying conversational point that everybody is inundated with, and we socialize with each other. So art, we can argue, does play a role in getting us to communicate even more. We communicate naturally without it, but having that central rallying talking point as one of the many pieces that we talk about, like religion and politics, it does shape how we talk to each other. It does influence our communications. For example, I mentioned line thickness. One student that I talked to said that the thicker the line, the more focused and calm the artist seemed to be in his perspective. By his perspective, I'm talking about the students, because that's how he felt when he saw the line. However, that answer provoked a large amount of discussion that continued for like 40 minutes in the group that I was with at that time. And that's because there was a lot of disagreement with just that one statement. While he felt that it indicated calmness and a focused perspective on behalf of the artist, some of the others did slightly agree with him, but not about the calmness, only about the point of focus on behalf of the artist. They argued that you have to be focused to put a thick line down, because you have to be doing it slowly. They argued about the technique on it. While others argued completely, saying, no, if you have to focus on putting weight to thicken a line on a piece of paper or on canvas, then you yourself have got to be the opposite. You can't be calm. Because that's a lot of focus for someone of a calm mind to exert. If you're a calm mind, you shouldn't need to focus at all. So to them, that very thick line that they would see essentially said that the artist was anything but calm. In fact, the artist was high-strung and tense, according to some of them. Or that the artist was completely upset and needed to calm down, and as such apparently used painting or drawing as the way of calming down. So the indecisiveness in the group alone and the lack of agreement on it show that, hey, again, conversation takes off when there's a mutual aspect that we're all inundated with and that we're all familiar with in some way. And as I was watching this interplay, Mouse's argument came to my mind. One of his arguments, anyway. As they were talking about it, the one student who proposed that the thick line indicated a calm mind, I looked at what I wrote down about him. His preference was thick lines. But some of the ones that had argued with him, saying that it was the sign of an emotionally distraught personality on behalf of the artist, were the ones that seemed to prefer thinner lines. Now, I noticed this paradigm with almost every group. In another group, the darker the color was, the happier the mind and the calmer the mind of the artist. But yet the lighter, it'd be more chaotic. But again, in that same group, there were people that disagreed with that perspective and said that lighter and brighter colors indicated a calmer, happier persona on behalf of the artist at the time when the painting or the film was made. But darker colors indicated the exact opposite. So this tells me, especially when I compared it to their personal preferences, this tells me that personal preferences can actually shape a person's perspective. It's essentially pulling on Mouse's argument that multiple factors can cause an individual to perform a certain action, but the idea is still there. There are factors that shape how we agree and how we disagree, which is the action, and those factors could be our preferences for certain things. Thinking about that, this takes me on into talking about the reasons why we tend to watch certain things or look at certain things versus why we don't look at others. Mouse argued that our tendencies to go for certain objects, to perform certain actions, are affected by our psychology and our biology. Which, knowing what I know about biology, I know that hormones essentially do play a role in kind of shaping how we interpret things. Our senses generally do play a role in how we interpret things. The way we process a picture through our eyes, and we hear a certain sound through our ears. How our brains interpret that does give us our preferences. And as such, that's the biological element for it. that shapes our psyche because we pick up said preferences, which then, like I said, causes us to perform certain actions, such as discussing, agreeing, and disagreeing certain aspects of visual art. This could also be played to thinking about just the interaction, again, like I said, in terms of why we watch and look at certain things. For example, the one set of reasons that I've heard primarily from the student body, though not consecutive among every group or individual that I interviewed, was that they used visual art as an escape. An escape from what? Was one thing I always asked. For some, it was the stress of student life, having all that homework. Yet for others, it was just an escape from the day because they had had a rough day. They didn't want to focus on anything, not their families, not their student work, their homework, the fact that they have an exam the next morning. They used it as a way of just getting out of where they are now, getting out of reality, and moving into an alternate life. A couple other reasons that I heard was boredom was the reason they turned to visual art. Curiosity was another. And general immersion in something different. So escape from stress, immersion in difference in something different, boredom because they've got nothing to do, and curiosity because they want to know what it is. To be honest, I wasn't expecting to hear the curiosity. Was not expecting it at all. Boredom? Wasn't really expecting to hear that one either. Escape? Wasn't quite sure that was one, but the immersion I was kind of expecting. People like to immerse themselves in something different every now and then. It's part of our nature. It's part of who we are as humans, which is something that every single person I interviewed said. So, since we like to immerse ourselves in different behaviors, why not immerse ourselves in different objects is one question that was asked to me by a student. Why can't we just also immerse ourselves in objects? Why should we treat it as different from just general behavior? Not surprised, she was a psychology major, so good point. As a result, I started asking, is it because it's different that you students use it? And are there differences in the visual arts that you do immerse yourselves in? Like, are there genre specifications that you look at, like comedy and romance or horror and action? To which I got a wide spectrum of responses, which again set off discussion. So it's like, okay, a lot of discussion here. Let's go with it. Well, again, the behaviors are triggered. Social interaction is triggered. So Mouse wasn't too far off when he argued that. And I could clearly see that idea working in all my interviewees and the groups. But watching and listening to them, the escape, not surprised. Wasn't expecting it, but I'm not surprised. But I had to ask about curiosity. And why did that come up as a reason? The 7 students I asked that of, the ones who had proposed it, they're like, It's just because it's different. It's something that we've not seen before. We haven't been introduced to it before. But it's similar enough to draw our eyes and to draw our attention to. One said that she, as a preference, liked squared objects, cubed objects, because they were clean cut and straightforward when I asked about geometrics. But cubes are four-sided, essentially. They're 4 lines because they're based off squares. There are multiple squares together. And she likes them because the lines are straight. But pentagonal figures and hexagonal figures were also appealing to her. Not as much as squares and cubes, but they had straight lines. Their angles were exactly measured. And they just appealed because of the similarities, but they were different enough to make her not like them as much as a cube or a square. So just watching and listening to this and learning this about students as I interviewed them for my art, I think I've gained a better understanding about why we do things, what we do them for, and how they lead to our social interactions. And essentially, just watching all of this has served to emphasize my argument that for students, visual arts is extremely attractive. And as such, they do immerse themselves in it, either through watching or discussing it, and this occurs for various reasons. I'm actually fairly fascinated, having learned what I've learned.